That's why he keeps getting reelected by overwhelming margins. Professor Hurwitz said earlier that you have to understand that this involves multiple statutes implemented by multiple agencies to govern technologies developed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s according to policy goals from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Just the opposite. We still had a stagnated marketplace. So we created new policies in the 1990s. 92 Cable Act, moving over 200 megahertz in 1993 to create the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cell phone license so that people weren't carrying on a brick-sized cell phone that cost 50 cents a minute, and then the 1996 Telecom Act. And then we saw an unleashing of these technologies in the 21st century. There was no Hulu, there was no YouTube, there were no Netflix. Okay? It's a 21st century unleashing of technology based upon 1990s policies. That's what we're debating here today. So a kid today who's 14 thinks that they have a constitutional right to a 50-inch screen, broadband, and a smartphone that they're watching at the same time. That wasn't possible before we created the new policies in the 1990s. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's all been caused by decisions that we made in the very recent past. And we've unleashed a massive amount of competition, Darwinian in some way, but deficient in others. We still don't have real competition on price. So consumers keep paying more and more. And so there is a deficiency actually in public policy because consumers feel they're being tipped upside down and have dollars shaken out of their pockets at the end of each and every month. So we have to discuss that as well. And now we have merger mania. We have company after company seeking to merge with other companies, all based upon what's been happening in the 21st century, not in the 60s, 70s, 80s, because the technologies were not there. So this is a big moment for us because we now have to determine the extent to which we're going to allow the consolidation that was undone actually by the policies of the 90s. We had pretty much one telephone company, not that much cable competition, no satellite dishes at all, and a couple of phone companies, cell phone companies that really weren't providing high quality service at all. So let me do the same thing you did, Senator Nelson. Let me say to you, Mr. Blum, I want to give you an expanded shot at explaining why you think this Comcast-Time Warner merger is bad for the marketplace, bad for consumers, bad for innovation, and then give Mr. Cohen a chance to come back and explain why he thinks it's good.
And Senator, it is really about broadband. All these great innovations that are happening, our attempts to enter the over-the-top business and Netflix and Hulu, those are wonderful things that are good for consumers. But those services compete with Comcast, Time Warner. The problem is they control the road which all those cars go on. They control the point of entry, called interconnection. They control the open internet, the right side of the road, and they have the ability to create super fast lanes for their own content. So you could have an 8-lane highway, 7 or super HOV lanes, and then all this great content that all of us are praising squeezed down to the right lane. That is not good for consumers, and that's why we are so concerned that a combined Comcast-Time Warner will leverage its control over the pipe to the detriment of consumers. And the notion that the FCC's broadband speeds of 4 megs down, 1 meg up is sufficient to watch House of Cards in 4K, it's just not. In order to take advantage of all these great services, you need a really high-speed connection and you need a really high-capacity connection. And so when Mr. Kimmelman and I talk about 50% under the control of Comcast Time Warner, it's 50% control of high-speed, high-capacity.
And you're saying you would have no protection against anti-competitive activity?
We would not.
You would not. Well, let's go back to you then, Mr. Cohen. Can you respond to that?
Well, I'm going to respond on a couple of levels. First of all, according to Netflix, which I believe is the producer of House of Cards, a 4 meg connection is sufficient to watch full DVD quality of an episode of House of Cards. And in any event, it's the current FCC definition of what broadband is. But even if you move that definition to 10 meg down, then 91% of the people living in America live in census tracts where there are at least two choices of a broadband provider. And again, the market share at 10 meg down after transaction would be 40% of wireline and 20% of wireless. And you've heard Mr. Stankey say the types of speeds that AT&T is talking about delivering wirelessly. So there's just more competition than Mr. Blum and Mr. Kimmelman are willing to acknowledge, number one. Number two, I don't agree that we have the incentive to block any lawful use of our broadband pipe. It's our most important business. And if we start blocking or degrading content, even if it is content of competitors, then we're going to lose customers and we're going to stop the growth of that business. So it's just not in our business interest to do so. But even if you don't accept that, I don't care what the open internet rules are going to look like, whether it's the 2010 rules or whether it's new rules under Section 706 and Title I, or whether it's Title II, which I don't agree with, and I hope that isn't where we end up. The one thing I am confident is going to be included in any rules that are put in place, and for which Comcast has no issue and no problem, is that we are not going to be able to block or degrade anyone's content on our network, whether it's competitive with us or not.
Okay, well,
I think the law is going to protect Dish with its pride. And then one other thing that I want to say, which is Mr. Blum keeps talking about how this new Dish product is going to compete with Comcast. It's going to compete with Dish, too. I mean, it's competing with their traditional service as well.
Okay, I understand. So the whole history of this is the incumbents trying to block competitors from getting access to the same consumers and degrading the quality of the service that the competitor can provide to the very same consumer, by default meaning that they will stick with the incumbent. Okay, so that's the whole history of this since the 38 years that I started on the Telecommunications Committee. And I just want to finish up with one quick question, if I can, and that's on municipal broadband. That would be to you, Mr. Cohen, and you, Mr. Stankey. Do either of your companies oppose municipalities being able to deploy their own broadband in their own municipality as a third wire that could be in that community? Do you oppose that corporately, Mr. Stankey, Mr. Cohen?
Oh, you want to go first, John?
Go ahead.
Go first. So, look, generally speaking, as a company, we have serious questions about whether municipalities should get into the broadband business, speaking personally.
But do you oppose them getting in?
I was in city government for 6.5 years. I know what city government can do. I think it's a mistake to do it. And so we will advocate at the municipal government level that we think this is a mistake. We are not, the answer is we don't oppose it. We don't have the right to oppose it.
I will just say this.
We have the right to advocate against it.
Again, more competition is the answer to all of these problems, so that Mr. Blum or Mr. Ryan or anyone else have more routes into the home. Right. And if we're talking about 2, we could talk about 3 if municipalities deployed broadband. And to not do that, in my opinion, kind of makes it harder for the government then not to get in and regulate in order to protect. See, my basic philosophy, just very simply, is that Darwinian, eye-watering, bone-chilling competition is the answer to all regulation. You don't need it.
Great.
But the smaller the number of competitors is the more regulation you need. And
all I'm going to say is that taxpayer subsidy of poorly run and ultimately bankrupt municipal broadband networks don't benefit anyone.
But if a community wants to do it, should they be allowed to do it?
They should be allowed to do it.
And do you agree with that, Mr. Stankey? If a community wants to deploy their own broadband system in competition with AT&T, in competition with Comcast, should they be allowed to do that?
If it's an underserved community where there's been no private solutions,
No.
That's what I'm saying.
A community that already has 2 companies.
We don't believe that private companies should actually compete against public subsidized taxpayer cost to capital in that market.
Well, they would never have more than 2. And again, that brings back the question of more regulation. See, that's the conundrum that you get into.
We're providing internet services in Austin today where we're investing today to build gigabit networks in which we compete against an incumbent cable company Google that is overbuilding at this
And
point.
I
And a
appreciate,
third overbuilder, a second overbuilder called Grande Communications, and there are 4 in that market. So there are more than 2 that play in these markets.
yeah, and I just think it's an area of competition where if a local municipality is unhappy, they want to have their own broadband system to make prices go down, and prices go down dramatically wherever a municipality is in. And all of a sudden, the 2 private sector incumbents find a way to lower prices, which is really what people desperately want at home. Mr. Chairman, I thank you so much for your indulgence.
Thank you, and indulgent I was. What I feel badly about is that Senator Heller, Senator Ayat, Senator you're not on the committee?